kick things off. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for our seminar series on the story of the Bible. So today you've got me, Craig, and Dave once again as your presenters. And specifically today, we're looking at Moses and the law. But before we get stuck into today's session, we'll do a bit of a recap of the last session, which was a couple of weeks ago now. During that session, we were introduced to Abraham, who was a man of such great faith that he left everything when God asked him to. And as a result of his awesome faith, God made some incredible promises to him. And there's three places in Genesis. Now, one of the places is Genesis 13, and I'll just read a couple of those verses to refresh your memories. We read from Genesis chapter 13, after Lot had gone, the Lord said to Abram, "Look as far as you can see in every direction, north and south, east and west. I am giving all this land as far as you can see to you and your descendants as a permanent possession. And I will give you so many descendants that like the dust of the earth, they cannot be counted." So just a bit of reminder there of the promises that God gave to Abraham. And you might just be wondering, why are we telling you all this stuff about promises that God made to Abraham way back when? Well, it's because of these golden threads of the gospel that we keep on about running through the Bible, and the fact that this promise relates also to us today. And in Galatians 3 verse 16, God gave the promises to Abraham and talked about his child. So just read from Galatians 3 verse 16 where it says, God gave the promises to Abraham and his child. And notice that the scripture doesn't say to his children as if it meant many descendants, rather it says to his child. And that, of course, means Christ. So these verses connect directly back in time to Genesis. They show that God's promises to faithful Abraham will in fact come through Jesus. And then even better, they show that we, through baptism, which we'll talk more about later in later sessions, can be directly linked to Jesus. And through Jesus, we can be directly linked to Abraham. The bottom line of all that is that we can be part of those promises as well, which is why we've made such a thing of showing them to you. And just remember that Abraham was a Jew. So the Jews as a people have been blessed and share in those promises because of Abraham and because of his faithfulness. And in Galatians chapter 3, verses 28, we read about this connection that I've been talking about. There is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And now that you belong to Christ, you are the true children of Abraham. You are his heirs, and God's promise to Abraham belongs to you. So there's pretty clear that by being associated with Christ, we become also associated with Abraham and we become heirs to the promises, which is amazing. Now, we know that God, in those promises, promised the land of Israel to Abraham forever and to his descendants. We know that that isn't the case at the moment. So we know that there's more to come that hasn't been fulfilled. And that the Bible tells us that Abraham will need to be resurrected in order to receive the ultimate fulfillment of that promise that God gave him. And just read verses 39 and 40 of Hebrews 11, talking about all the people in that chapter of Hebrews 11, that they all earned good reputation because of their faith. yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. So the opportunity for us to be a part of those promises is still there. For how much longer, we don't know, but it is still there. Now, before I go on, is there any questions from the last session? Anything out of what I've just quickly raced through there now before I get into the next session? All right, take that as a good sign. So this timeline that we keep building on, you'll see here that we've moved along and we're in the period, where's my cursor? We're in the period here between about 2000 BC and up to 0 AD. And you can see here that we've added in these promises to Abraham and the fact that we can become heirs to those promises too. And we'll keep on building that as we go. Now, this slide is just a little bit of a demonstration or a bit of a description, I guess, of Abraham and his descendants, because part of what he was promised was a massive amount of family or descendants, so much so that they couldn't be counted. And just to quickly go through this, he had 2 wives, Sarah and then Hagar, who was a sort of a servant, a woman that he had a child with because Sarah couldn't have children for a long while. Ishmael was the son, and from him comes the Arabs, descended from him, the Bible tells us. So that way there's also a lot of descendants. But here there was Abraham, his son Isaac, Esau, Jacob, and then you can see from Jacob came what we call the start of the 12 tribes of Israel. Basically, these people here, they were the tribes of Israel. Different, there was different wives involved in different things, but you can sort of see from that many people fairly quickly, you would get a lot of children, grandchildren, and so on and so on. And they lived for quite a bit longer in those days than what we do now. In fact, for, several hundreds of years at times they lived. So you could reproduce quite quickly. Might have started off slow, but the ball got rolling pretty quick. Now, Israel ended up moving to Egypt because of a famine around about 1650. Now, they started with 75 people. That's what moved into Egypt. At the end of 200 years, the amount of people had increased to about 2 million. So that's a lot. My very basic calculations worked out that's around about, I think, 10,000 babies a year for those 200 years to get to that. But just as we've sort of pointed out with that family tree, it's certainly possible in the right conditions. And also there's a guy called Samuel Must. He's actually in the Guinness Book of Records for having the most number of descendants, most living descendants, and it's 824 is the total. He died aged 96. So just to sort of show, because sometimes people say, well, that's impossible. How could you get that many? When you've got a lot of people to start with who are living for a longer time and under the right conditions, people can breed very quickly. So it certainly is possible. Now, Joseph, we haven't really dealt with. Joseph was actually one of the sons you would have seen on the previous slide of Jacob. Now, his brothers were jealous of him. He was the favourite, and they sold him off into slavery to get rid of him. And he ended up in Egypt. Now, through God's help and also through his own really good character and faithfulness, he worked his way up into a good position where he was, in fact, quite close to Pharaoh. And he had been a really astute, loyal, and profitable servant to the Pharaoh of his time. Now, he had some visions or dreams that were brought to him by God, and he helped Egypt to prepare for the great famine that he foresaw. They built massive storehouses because of his advice. So they stored up grain and different bits and pieces. So they were not only able to provide for themselves during this famine, but they were also able to sell food, grain, and things to all the surrounding nations. And no doubt they made a tidy profit on doing that at the time. So Joseph was actually a really well-respected and almost a bit of a revered character who was second only really to Pharaoh in Egypt at his time. And so as a result, his family, when they moved to Egypt because of the famine, were treated really well. And I guess in really good conditions, as we can see, they multiplied quickly. Now, the new Pharaoh, unfortunately, saw them as, at best, a real pain, and at worst, as a potential serious threat. Because you've got this other race of people who are populating and growing very quickly, very close by. So they started to become treated quite badly. They were basically made into slaves, and they were forced to work under extremely harsh conditions. Now, we see at the bottom of this last point here that that's the Israelites, they cried out to God in this oppression and slavery. It was a terrible time for them, and God sent to them this character, Moses. Now, we don't have a great deal in our books and things about Moses, but I've just got a little summary, because his story alone could probably fill its own seminar if you wanted to go right into it. Now, Moses survived in a time when all the male babies, the Jewish male babies, were being killed. This was how bad the Pharaoh saw the Jews as a threat. So any of the male young babies, they were just being killed so that they couldn't reproduce, they couldn't grow up into an army, all of those things. Quite horrendous. Now, his parents floated him down the river in a little basket, and he was found by the Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised in the palace. He was educated and taught all the ways of the Egyptians. So he was quite close to the Pharaoh, to all the people in the palace. Now, when he started to understand a little bit more about the situation that his people, the Jews, were in, he actually ended up leaving the palace. He spent about 40 years away from the whole place, being prepared by God. There's a lot of gaps in this, but being prepared by God for the role that he was to play. And he actually returned to face Pharaoh, and his role was to lead the Jews out of the land of Egypt. So that's a very brief summary about Moses. Like I said, you can look into that in the Bible. His story is quite fascinating. And the way that worked was by this thing called the 10 plagues. Now, these plagues were aimed at the various gods the Egyptians worshipped. Now, we're not going to go into all of them into detail. For all of them, it would take a long time. You can read about them for yourselves in the book of Exodus. Now, Pharaoh had magicians and wise men, and through trickery, they were able to imitate some of the plagues. Now, just for example, we'll pick out the frogs. In Exodus 8, we read, God said to Moses, "Go back to Pharaoh and announce to him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs across your entire land. The Nile River will swarm with frogs. They will come up out of the river and into your palace, even into your bedroom and onto your bed. They will enter the houses of your officials and your people. They will even jump into your ovens and your kneading bowls. Frogs will jump on you, your people, and all your officials. So pretty horrendous. Verse 7, though, of that chapter says, but the magicians were able to do the same thing with their magic. They too caused frogs to come up on the land of Egypt. Now, we don't know how or what they did, but just that they were able to somehow replicate frogs. Interesting to know that they couldn't always do it, though. The plague of the gnats, in verse 18 of Exodus chapter 8, it says, all the dust of the land of Egypt turned into gnats. Pharaoh's magicians tried to do the same thing with their secret arts, but this time they failed. And the gnats covered everyone, people and animals alike. This is the finger of God, the magicians exclaimed to Pharaoh. But Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He wouldn't listen to them, just as the Lord had predicted. Now, what's really interesting to note through all of these plagues is that the land of Goshen, which was where the Jews lived in Egypt, was not affected by the plagues. Now, either were their livestock or the people themselves. And you can see there's some pretty bad things: boils, flies, locusts, pretty horrible. The Jews were actually not affected, and their cattle and their sheep and all that wasn't affected either. Now, all the way through this, Moses was asking or demanding that Pharaoh let the Jews go. Now, several times Pharaoh agreed, but then reneged. And the final plague we can see down here, the death of the firstborn, was so terrible that the Jews were basically kicked out. And we'll have a little bit more of a look at that one because it's quite significant. Now, in Exodus chapter 12, very specific directions were given to the Jews. They had to select a lamb, 1-year-old lamb. It had to be as perfect as they could find. It says no spot or blemish. It had to be killed, but no bones could be broken. And what they had to do was take the blood from that lamb and paint it on the door uprights and the lintel, so around the door frame. The Israelites had to stay inside the house. Now, if they strayed outside the house, they were fair game. They had to follow the directions that they were given. And if they stayed inside the house, the angel of death would pass over them. Now, here's another one of these golden threads that we keep on about. Now, remember way back in Genesis, we talked about Adam and Eve when they sinned. We talked about the fact that God made them coverings from animal skins and about the principle of the shedding of blood being required to cover sins. We talked about how that pointed forwards to Jesus, and we looked at a few verses. Well, this is another one. This is quite clear that the shed blood of the lamb on the door frame was what made that angel of death pass over and spared the people inside. It's very clearly stated. And there is a clear link in this to Jesus. The obedience to God and the shedding of the blood was what allowed the people to escape from this horrible plague. Now, 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, it actually talks about Christ and calls him our Passover lamb, and that he has been sacrificed for us. I hope that you're all starting to join some dots now. And if nothing else, hopefully you're starting to see that all of these different events from different time frames and different places, they all link back to Jesus, the seed of the woman that we talked about right back in the first week from Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. Now just pause here for a sec Any questions before I keep going? If not, that's good. We'll press on. So, needless to say, the Egyptians, quite unfortunately, all lost their firstborns, which threw the whole country into chaos and mourning and grief. The Jews were allowed to exit. In fact, they were given a lot of gifts, and the people just wanted them to get out because they knew that they were being punished for holding them back. They were being punished by their God. And in fact, the word Exodus just simply really means going out. So that whole book of Exodus is about them going out from Egypt. Now, God led the people. Oops. And we read in Exodus chapter 13, verses 21 and 22, that the Lord went ahead of them. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided at night, light at night, with a pillar of fire. Now this allowed them to travel by day or by night. And the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or the pillar of fire from its place in front of the people. Now God led them away from Egypt, and he led them to the Red Sea and told them to camp at the shore. Now, naturally, Pharaoh, being a little bit shifty as he had shown himself, after initially being extremely sad and grieving, got very, very angry. And he sent the army, the whole army, after the Jews to make them pay. So the Jews were at the Red Sea. They were trapped between it and the chasing army, rapidly descending on them, intent on slaughtering them in revenge for what had happened. Now the people immediately panicked, and they said this to Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why have you made us leave Egypt? Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness." So they were very upset and perhaps had lost a little bit of faith given the incredible miracles, plagues that had led to them being released from Egypt in the first place. However, Moses had a lot of faith, which was why God chose him. Now, he told them to trust God and that they would be saved. And in Exodus 14, we read what happened. We're told God told Moses to do this. So then Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all that night, turning the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground with walls of water on each side. Then the Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots and charioteers, chased them into the middle of the sea. But just before dawn, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw their forces into total confusion. He twisted their chariot wheels, making their chariots difficult to drive. "Let's get out of here, away from these Israelites," the Egyptians shouted. "The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Now, once the Jews had all made it through, God told Moses to again raise his hand over the water, and the water came rushing back into place and destroyed the entire Egyptian army. We're told that after seeing this, the Israelites were filled with awe, and that they put their faith in God and his servant Moses, and that they danced and sang songs of praise to God. Sadly, their memories were short. Not long later, they came to a place called Marah, where they found that the water was too bitter for them to drink. Now, they complained straight away and turned against Moses. They said, "What are we going to drink?" they demanded. Moses cried out to the Lord for help, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and this made the water good to drink. So the people were happy again. However, God was well aware of the fickle nature of the majority of the people, and he gave them the following for them to think about. God said to them, "If you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, obeying his commands and keeping all his decrees, then I will not make you suffer any of the diseases I sent on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Now, unfortunately, this was just the first of many times that the people whinged and complained and, I guess, sort of lost a bit of their faith. Now, if it wasn't for the faith and the pleading of Moses, God would probably have killed most of the people. Many hundreds of years later, the Apostle Paul wrote these words in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He said, "I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. All of them were guided by a cloud that moved ahead of them, and all of them walked through the sea on dry ground. In the cloud and in the sea, all of them were baptized as followers of Moses." Now, Paul goes on to say, "Yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. These things happened as a warning to us, so that we would not crave evil things as they did, or worship idols as some of them did. As the scriptures say, the people celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. And we must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did, causing 23,000 of them to die in one day." Now, further on in the same chapter, Paul writes, "These things happened to them as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age." I'll just let you think about that one. I don't think I need to explain it too much more. Now, what we've got here is a map, and it gives us an idea of where the people were led by God when they escaped from Egypt. And we'll talk a bit more, Dave will talk a bit more later about what caused them to do a whole lot more wandering in this wilderness than what they otherwise might have done. But you can see from this that it's actually quite a large distance that they covered. It wasn't just a small, they weren't just wandering around on little day trips. There's quite a lot of distance that they went to finally get to Gilgal up in the north there of Israel. And I can now hand over to you, Dave. I'll stop sharing. I will stop sharing shortly.
I'll start sharing, see if I can kick you off.
Yeah, all right. Good.
Cool. Thanks very much, Craig. Really well laid out. And so, yeah, anyone that's first time joining, my name's Dave Green. I'll be one of the presenters for these 8-week seminar series. So, yeah, as Craig has sort of led us up to this point, they've just got through those waters, and they've found themselves at Mount Sinai. And it's at Mount Sinai that God reveals himself to Moses, reveals his name and aspects about his character, and also starts to give this sort of new-fledged nation some laws and some guiding principles around how they should live their lives and how they should function as a nation. And so there's a number of aspects that sort of get grouped into the law of Moses, including the 10 Commandments. So yeah, for the next few minutes, we'll be looking at this. And it really would have been really radical for its time. You got to think of when this was, that there wasn't a lot of laws, especially around social justice. And so this would have been very new to all the nations around the children of Israel. And Israel could never doubt that God had made them and preserved them. God destroyed their enemies in Egypt and delivered them by his miraculous power. Israel's privileges depended on their faithfulness to God, as we'll sort of find out as we have a look at these laws. He gave them the law of Moses to build that focus on worship. We'll talk about the tabernacle in a few minutes' time. It was set up in the wilderness, and sacrifices began with that establishment of this tabernacle, and the priests and the Levites were appointed to their office. And so hopefully as we go through and expand that, these terms, priests and Levites that we find in the New Testament, you find out their root, the roots of where they came from the Old Testament and the law of Moses. So really the law was needed to guide this new nation. They really needed a set of principles and guidance. So yeah, like I said, when Moses was up at Mount Sinai, God provided him 10 commandments. This is really the basis of what the law of Moses was established on. So most people would have heard the 10 commandments, but how many people can recite them? So they're actually broken up into 3 different areas. So the first were relating to God, so the first 4. So no other gods before me was the first one. No idols. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. And so we see that quite prevalent in today with people taking the Lord's name in vain. And observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. So the first 4. The next one was just relating to the parents. Honor your father and mother. Really important as a father myself. Appreciate that one. And the remaining was relating to fellow man. So you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, and you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. So some of these may have been established in regards to, not murdering in other nations, but these other ones around, internal thinking and some guiding principles around that internal thinking would have really been new and radical, like I said. So the 10 commandments were for men to be responsible for their actions towards God and others. In every commandment, there is the call to deny self and live only to serve others. Selflessness is one of the dominating features. So while the commands given to Moses were for the nation of Israel, the principles behind them apply to us today, just as much as they did back then. The Western justice system that we have today is founded on biblical laws and justice. In the New Testament, in Matthew 22, verse 37, Jesus showed the essence of the law. It says, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these 2 commands hang all the law and the prophets." So Jesus was very unique, as we know, and he had an amazing ability to articulate really complex principles and lists of laws down to 2 very simple principles. And if we apply these principles in our life, we find that we have a life of peace and security. So Jesus reaffirmed 9 of the 10 commandments, given them as even and gave them even greater meaning. The only commandment not reinstated in the New Testament concerns keeping the Sabbath. In fact, we're told to keep God in our lives every day, and that there is no need to hold one day as special above any other. A couple of verses that back this up is Colossians, Mark, and Galatians. I'll just read the Galatians one. Galatians 3:24. Therefore, the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, we are no longer under the tutor. So to simplify that, I suppose you could say the law was preparing the children of Israel, this new nation, we're preparing them for Jesus Christ, the Messiah, to come. And we've established in earlier sessions, as Craig alluded to, in regards to that timeline, that seed, that promise Messiah that was coming on that blue line throughout the whole timeline, that golden theme throughout the whole Bible. And the law was in a way preparing them for that. But once Jesus came and we're justified by faith through Jesus, we no longer need to keep Moses's law. But as we've just briefly talked about, there were a few things that we still need to do. So in addition to the 10 Commandments, further guidance and instructions were given. These expressed God's will on a variety of subjects and provided laws which regulated the attitude of the Israelites to God and his worship, to each other and to the nations around them. These various laws and principles together came to be known as the Law of Moses. So obedience to the law was required for Israel to continue to be the custodian of the land of promise, which they're heading to as they wander through the land of the wilderness, until the Messiah appeared, as we've been discussing, the blue line in the timeline. So let's look at a few examples of the Law of Moses, and in particularly some laws on social justice. So the first one in Exodus 22, verse 26 to 27, I'll just be really brief. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but it says, and you feel free to look it up with your own Bibles if you like, but it says, if you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it to him by sunset, because his cloak is the only covering he has for his body. What else will he sleep in? When he cries out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. So once again, really radical for its time in regards to some of these. The next one is Leviticus 19, verse 15. It says, do not pervert justice, do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Once again, radical for its time. This is starting to think outside yourself and looking after your neighbor. And in the then society, hierarchy was a really strong thing where the poor were considered less than human. But these laws are starting to bring in these foreign concepts to the then known time around looking after your neighbor. There's been some laws around, he's establishing some laws around environmental protection. So in Deuteronomy 20, verse 19, it says, when you lay siege to a city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat the fruit. Do not cut them down. Are the trees of the field people that you should besiege them? So it's not only a very practical thing when you're laying siege to a city, don't destroy the trees that are giving you food to sustain your army, but it's also, there's a secondary point there about just don't cut them down, leave them there. And as we see in modern times with deforestation, a big issue with climate change and so forth, these laws were established thousands of years ago and were very ahead of its time. And obviously, in today's world, animal rights and so forth is a big issue as well about how we treat animals. This is no new thing for people that read their Bibles. In Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, it says, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain, just as a small example of some laws around even looking after animals. These laws were also ahead of its time in regards to science. So basically, God is saying here in Exodus 15, verse 26 to his people, that if you follow my commandments, I'm going to keep you healthy. I'm going to not bring disease into your population. And he could absolutely have done that with his Holy Spirit, but he also gives them some very practical direction and laws to follow in regards to hygiene and cleanliness. So this one's about, if you're going to go to the toilet, make sure you cover it. Make sure you go outside the camp. And, it's only in our recent history that we understand the biological risk that human refuse has to large human populations, where we've got modern sewer networks and things like that that look after that sort of sanitation. But this was established thousands of years ago in regards to God being the ultimate scientist, knowing exactly the risk this would propose to a large population. Also leprosy, and as we look at a world, that's overtaken by COVID-19, we're all very familiar with quarantine. But that's a relatively new principle as we've learned more about biological transfer of organisms and bugs between human beings. It's only in recent times where we understand the reasons why we need to put people in quarantine. But once again, thousands of years ago, the ultimate scientist, God, put these things in place in regards to quarantine people that had diseases like leprosy. Had a recipe for soap in Numbers 19, verses 5 to 6. and also some instruction around when we touch dead bodies. So once again, only go back 300, 250, 300 years, and the doctors that were delivering babies had come from an autopsy of a dead body, and they weren't washing their hands between touching the corpse and the live mother and the baby. And mothers and babies were just dying at a massive rate. There was a certain scientific name that they gave it because they didn't understand what was causing the fatalities. And it's only as they learnt more about the transfer of disease and bacteria that they realized it was actually the doctors transferring the illness from the dead bodies to the live patients. But once again, God established some really clear principles about, quarantine yourself and obviously washing your hands and so forth after touching dead bodies and so forth. So yeah, really, really awesome. To me, it speaks of the creator, the designer of us all. This speaks that the Bible is inspired by the creator and gives these insights. And there's actually some really cool other examples of basically science in the Bible. Well, thousands of years ahead of time when man actually discovered these things. So going back to our timelines, so for those that potentially are new to this course, so this is week 3. So we've had 2 previous sessions, and over this time we've been building this timeline. So we believe that the Bible articulates a 7,000 year period of time. 6,000 years. So sorry, go back to the creation at 4,000 BC. So I don't have the slide of the previous 2,000 years, but you see this timeline here. It goes from 4,000 BC, 3 to 1 and 0 AD, and then 100 AD, 1000 AD, 2000 AD. So we're obviously in 2021, so we're about here on the timeline. So we believe the Bible speaks to this timeline, and that in the future there will be a 1,000-year kingdom age. And so the period of time we're talking about today is in this 2,000 years here, with some common themes that Craig referred to as well in regards to the golden thread or the common theme running through the Bibles. That being sin and death, Jesus and seed, and earth and kingdom. And so as we've been going through and building out this timeline, we're linking key events and verses and themes to these themes running throughout the Bible. So obviously the blue being Jesus and the seed, as Craig talked to, we've articulated some of the promises made in Genesis 3:15, promises made to Abraham, all linking to that future seed Jesus. So here we are, Joseph in Egypt. We had 200 years of Egyptian slavery, bringing us roughly to 1500 BC. Moses has come on the scene, as Craig articulated, and then they got out of Egypt after the 10 plagues. And then we've got the 10 commandments sitting there around 1491 BC. So that's a little bit of session. So is there any thoughts, questions or comments on what we've covered so far? Okay, if there's nothing, we might just break just for 2 minutes. If anyone wanted to get a drink, go to the toilet. So we'll reconvene in 2 minutes, about 2:16. We'll get back underway.
This is a picture of what's called the tabernacle. It's not a real picture, it's a picture of a recreation of what we think, or people think, that the tabernacle might have looked like. And the tabernacle is basically a portable temple that could be used for camping, I suppose, more or less, because when they were in the wilderness, that's what they were doing. It provided a way for the people to be able to worship God according to the laws that they had been given by God. Now, size-wise, you can see up here, it showed an American gridiron field, which I had no idea how big that was. It's actually 91 metres by 49 metres, just so that we might get a bit more of an idea. A rugby field, either rugby league or union, is actually 100 metres long and probably, I think, about 50 or a bit more than 50 metres wide. So that's the size of the tabernacle in there. I'm not going to try and guess how much that is, but you can sort of see. Not that big, not tiny, but not really huge either. Now, again, the study of the tabernacle is probably something that could have its own seminar as well, pretty much. You can see that there's quite a few things in there. There's different bits of furniture. There's numbers here that relate to all these different bits and pieces that are in there. They all have a lot of significance. Most of them are very closely related to and point forward to Jesus and the work that he did for us. They're also quite interconnected with God's larger plan and themes and things that are woven throughout the Bible. It's something that can definitely be studied in depth, at another time. We'd be happy to help anyone with that. We might even come up with some sort of seminar one day that covers something like that as a bit of an offshoot subject from this. But I don't want to get too far away from the direction of our session today. So it just gives you an idea. It was quite complicated, very specific. They were given directions by God. You've probably been reading the stuff that's on the page there, hopefully. So yeah, that's an idea of what it looked like anyway. Now, we've talked about this concept of the shedding of blood being required to make up for sins or human inadequacies or failures. So again, going right back to where we first started in the Garden of Eden, that principle that was established by God, that the shedding of blood was required to atone for, to cover for, or to make up for sins. And again, what I spoke about just before, it was very clearly shown in Egypt with the Israelites killing the lamb and painting its blood on the doorposts. They were saved by the shedding of the blood of those lambs. And similarly, but probably a little bit more complicated, the law of Moses required various types of sacrifices for various occasions or sins or issues when the people, went wrong or they were unable to manage to follow the law properly. And you can see there's different ones here: burnt offering, grain offering, fellowship offering, sin offering, guilt offering. Now, the bottom line is that all of these things point forward to Jesus, and they show that humans, people, are unable to earn or deserve God's forgiveness, but that they failed all the time. They couldn't keep this law. And really what they earned or deserved under the law was in fact death, because that was a consequence for a lot of the failures. However, through this shedding of blood, they were able to not be killed. And just as an example, in these things, when they brought a lamb or a sheep or an animal for particular offerings, the person who brought that often had to put their hand on the head of the animal as it was killed, and it was their best animal, not just a poxy one that was no use to anybody. They had to bring their best animal, and they had to understand that this animal was actually dying instead of them dying. So it was a really strong principle that was brought home to them. It wasn't an easy thing for them to do. They couldn't just drop it off and, head on back to camp. They had to stand there and watch it all happen and be part of it, which isn't all that pleasant, but the principle of it is very serious, and so it wasn't meant to be pleasant either. It was meant to really bring it home to them. Now, again, these things could also probably be their own seminar, so I'm going to leave it at that. There's a whole lot of different sacrifices that require different things at different times. And I'll just move on to the way they camped. So it was set up in a very specific way, their camp. There is significance and there's quite a bit of interest in all of this as well. Again, another quite deep study if you go into all the types of all of these things and where they point forward to. Probably better tackled on its own and on another day. Now, Moses, Aaron, and the Levites were set apart. This area that was between the tabernacle and the rest of the people was a separate area. And this is a principle that God set in place right from early on to be followed, that the priests were set apart by God to be between him and the people. And we'll probably talk a bit more about mediators and things like that in later sessions, so it will become a little bit more clear. Now, another thing to think about is the logistics of having 2+ million people in a camp and having them being able to actually set up camp, break camp, march all day, and then set up camp again. So it needed to be done in a very specific and orderly fashion, part of which was just the practicality of being able to manage such a massive group of people. When you watch a group of people packing up on holidays, it can be quite funny because no one knows what they're doing and people get upset and it takes a long time. So, everybody had a job, everyone knew where they had to go here. And I imagine it was, well, probably not always smooth sailing totally, but it was done with great precision. And that was also part of it. Now, Dave mentioned before priests, Levites. So there was this tribe called Levi, which we saw on that family tree earlier. They're actually Aaron, Moses' brother, he was from the tribe of Levi. Now, his direct descendants were the actual priests. Now, all of these people were called Levites, but the sons of Aaron were the actual priests, and the rest of the ones who weren't his direct descendants but were still part of the tribe, they did work that was to do with setting up the temple, obviously pulling it down, putting it back up every time they traveled and camped. That was a big job in itself. So while other people were setting up their tents and pulling them down, wherever, they were doing the same thing with the tabernacle or the temple, the portable temple. Now, they also had quite a lot of festivals. And this is just a bit of an illustration to have a quick look at. It sort of shows our months, January, February, March, etc., around the calendar, and gives you a bit of an idea of when different festivals occurred in comparison to our time, I guess. Again, another pretty complicated subject with a lot of information attached to it. Now, these festivals, they weren't just the people's excuse to, have a bludge and a party or whatever. They're actually set quite clearly and specifically by God in Deuteronomy chapter 16. And we won't wade our way through all of these things today because it would just get very confusing, I think, and I find it pretty confusing myself. So anyone who's coming to this, for the first time or whatever would, I think, be very confused. The take-home message really from these feasts and celebrations is the fact that they were a reminder to the people to be thankful to God for their blessings and to recognize that everything that they had came from God. Now, that started with the Feast of the Passover, which is the reminder about how they got delivered by God out of Egypt for the killing of the firstborn. So where the angel of death passed over their house, that's where the term Passover comes from. So that's their first feast. And that sort of sets the scene, I think, to remind them that the fact that they're not still slaves and they're free, but they might be in this wilderness at the stage that we're looking at. However, the fact that they're free and they're not in slavery was because of God. And they started from there, and then everything else they had, these things, unleavened bread, first fruits, harvest, all this stuff, was all to remind them that all that they had was because they were following God's commandments and they were being blessed by him. So that's really the bottom line. There's a lot of specifics, but that's the bottom line from these festivals and feasts. Now, let's think about the purpose of this law. So, number one was to set them apart as a divine people. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 6 to 8, we read this. They were to obey the laws. If they obeyed the laws completely, it says, you will display your wisdom and intelligence among the surrounding nations. When they, that's the people around them, hear all these decrees, they will exclaim, how wise and prudent are the people of this great nation. These are the things that Dave was talking about earlier, the things that they did that set them apart with cleanliness and their camps and all of those things that God had given to them. For what great nation has a God as near to them as the Lord our God is near to us whenever we call on him? And what great nation has decrees and regulations as righteous and fair as this body of instructions that I am giving you today? So that was one purpose of it. Next purpose of it is basically to show what human nature is all about. And we've got some verses here, Romans 5, Galatians 3, and Romans 3, verse 21. And I'll just read Romans 3, verse 21. It says, but now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ unto all and upon all them that believe. For there is no difference, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. What the law showed was that it was almost totally impossible to be able to manage to do everything right. As I mentioned before, it demonstrated very clearly that God's approval cannot be earned or deserved. Because of the failure of humans to be able to follow what's required of them, because of our sin nature that we got from Adam and Eve, which we looked at in the first session that we covered, what basically is deserved under the law that God gave for them because of their failure would have been death. But deliverance from death came through the goodwill or the grace of God in those sacrifices that he provided for them also under the law, because he knew they wouldn't be able to keep it. And the final purpose that we've got for today is it was to direct the nation of Israel to their Redeemer, and the Redeemer is the seed of the woman, which is Jesus. Now, this is the golden thread of salvation that runs through the entire Word of God. I know I've been on about this a lot, but it's very important. It comes in from about the 3rd page of the Bible in Genesis, and it's there all the way through at different points, right up to the last page of the book of Revelation. The only way that anyone, Israelites or us, can be saved is through faith in God and belief in his Son, who gave his life as a covering for all of our sins. And we've talked about that principle as we've gone along. And that verse there, Galatians 3 verse 24, it says, the law was our guardian until Christ came. It protected us until we could be made right with God through faith. The one in Colossians 2 is good. I mean, Genesis 3 verse 15, we've dealt with that a fair bit. But Colossians 2, don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink, or for not celebrating certain holy days, or the new moon ceremonies or Sabbaths. So this is talking about us in our time now. We don't need to follow that law of Moses anymore, because those rules are only shadows of the reality yet to come. And Christ himself is that reality. So I'll hand over to you now, Dave.
Thanks, Greg. Cool. So, yeah, really well explained, Craig. Was there any more questions there around the purpose of the law? Alpha, you had some really good questions there, mate. Did you have anything further on that subject, mate? We do cover it off a bit more, like I said, in week 6. No, all good. No worries at all. All right, we'll keep going. So we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about their time in the wilderness. So you may or may not have heard that the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. That's a really, really long time. So did it really take that long to actually travel to the promised land from Mount Sinai? Or is there something more to this story? The Bible book of Numbers tells this story. So the book of Numbers follows Moses and Israel's journey from the foot of Mount Sinai, which is where Leviticus ends, and is number 8 on that map that you see up there, to the edge of the promised land of Canaan. That's number 10. If there were a regular road trip if it was going to be a regular road trip of the time, it should have only taken them 2 weeks. So why did it take 40 years? When the people get about halfway there, Moses sends a few spies into the land to scout it out for the upcoming invasion. The current inhabitants probably weren't going to welcome them with open arms. Most of the spies came back in a panic, claiming that the Canaanites were far too powerful, far too big for Israel to overcome. The walls were just too high. So this leads to a revolt, with the people refusing to take the land. God gives them their wish, decreeing that that whole generation will die in the wilderness, and the land will be taken by their children. There are many things we could talk to during this 40-year wandering. However, we will draw out 2 that stands out. Firstly, we'll briefly look at the account of the serpent on a pole. So they are well and truly in their 40-year wandering, and things are pretty tough, and good quality food and water is scarce, even though God did provide both. But they still complain. So let's pick up the story in Numbers 21 verses 5 to 9. So feel free to turn this up. I'll read it out, but feel free to turn it up yourself. So that was Numbers chapter 21 verses 5 to 9. And hopefully as we go through this, you'll realize why we're going to just spend 1 or 2 minutes on it this afternoon. So Numbers 21 verse 5-9 says, and the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there's no food, no water, and our souls loathe this worthless bread. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned. for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that you take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it up on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten when he looks at it shall live." So Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. So it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. So I'll pose the question here. Do we see any linkages here? Is there any way we could link this story to any of the golden threads that we've been talking about? Any themes, any of those blue or red themes in the timeline? Let's see what the New Testament has to say. So Jesus says in John 3, verse 14 and 15, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." Pretty black and white, isn't it? I don't think I need to explain that further. So going back to the first 2,000 years that we covered off in week 1 and 2, we talked a lot about the fall. And surprise, lo and behold, a serpent representing that is like a type of sin played a role in the fall of man. And that led to sin nature being introduced. And then we were giving the promise of hope in Genesis 3:15. And that was really talking about the seed of the woman, which is Jesus Christ, which will destroy sin, which is yet to come in the future for all of mankind. So you get some strong linkages there to this serpent and having a way of salvation by looking up at it. And then obviously the promises made to Abraham further reinforces the themes of that seed and how we become heirs to those promises. And so we can see a direct linkage here to Jesus Christ in getting the people used to and preparing them for their coming Messiah. The next one we'll briefly look at is Moses' sin. So Moses was described as a friend of God. He was faithful and he was a courageous leader. However, he was also human. He inherited the sin nature that we inherited from Adam and Eve. So before the 40-year wandering was concluded, Moses committed a sin, and as a result, he would not be able to lead the Israelites into the promised land. Let's briefly summarize what happened and why it's important. So back in Numbers 17, the people complained again, and God instructed Moses to strike a rock and water would come forth to provide clean water for the people, which he did. Tick. In Numbers 20, the people complained again, and this time God said to speak to the rock. Instead, out of frustration, Moses said, "Here now, you rebels, must we bring water out for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. That's from Numbers 20, verses 10 to 11. So you notice he referred to himself as well, "must we bring." So what's the big deal about that? You know, it sounds like he was just following what he was commanded to do the first time as well. So let's read 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 to 4. So once again, happy for you to turn it up in your own Bibles, but if not, I'll read it out. So that's 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 to 4. And I quote, "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." So we see here, Moses took the glory when he said we, and he broke a really important tie God was establishing with his people. And you can see just the close interlinks between the New Testament and Old Testament. I mean, once again, we talked about it in previous weeks. You really can't have the one without the other. You can't read the New Testament in isolation without understanding all the lead up in the Old Testament. They are so closely interlinked, and these themes of salvation and even baptism. So where we looked at how Moses going through the sea with the cloud overhead and the waters, each side was a type of baptism, them leaving their old life in Egypt behind, going into their new life, eventually into the promised land. So lots of those beautiful themes that we keep picking up on. So as a result, Moses did not enter the promised land. And that was a result of his sin. So Moses died at the end of the long period in the wilderness, and Joshua took over as leader of Israel. It was Joshua who led the people into the land instead. Perhaps the most famous incident from this period is the conquering of Jericho. The people marched around the wall for 7 days. Then when they shouted, God caused the walls of the city to collapse, and Israel captured the city. This was part of the initial central campaign to conquer Canaan. So, and, once again, the Bible is just proven time and time again. They have found Jericho and they have found the walls actually collapsed in such a way, catastrophically collapsed, in such a way that it actually created a ramp for the invading army to get into Jericho. And once again, everything we dig out of the ground, archaeological evidence, and so many other evidence proves to us that the Bible is accurate and from the inspired author God. So following this central campaign, 2 further campaigns were conducted by Joshua against the Confederate forces of the Canaanites in the south. You can see here some of the southern campaign and also the northern campaign. So the strong nations were subdued, and it remained for the individual tribes to move into their allocated territories. So they were each given a portion of land that they were to move into, and to remove the remaining pockets of resistance. God had thus honored his promise to take Israel out of Egypt and bring them back into Canaan. So this section of history closes with Joshua's last words to the nation he had served so faithfully. He reminded them of the indisputable blessings showered on them as a nation from the call of Abraham onwards. God had guided the course of their national life, saving and delivering them in times of peril. This realization is made the basis of his final plea to the people to serve God in spirit and in truth. So before I summarize this week's seminar series, was there any questions or comments from that? No? That's cool. So in summary, we covered off, we briefly touched on Abraham, then we looked at Abraham's son Isaac. And once again, given that we're condensing the whole Bible into 8 weeks, we are skipping some stories and some accounts of what happened to Isaac, and some really strong linkages to Jesus Christ there with Isaac. And Jacob, how his name got changed from Jacob to Israel, and how he had those sons, 12, which became the 12 tribes of Israel, and the story of Joseph. We covered off Moses and deliverance from Egypt and the 10 plagues, and how God actually prophesied back to Abraham that his people would be in that bondage for all those hundreds of years, but he would deliver them and he would judge that land of Egypt, which he did. They were in the wilderness, as we learnt, and it could have just been a 2-week journey, just quick in and out and into the promised land. But due to their lack of faith in God, that whole generation passed away. We quickly touched on Mount Sinai, where God revealed himself, and they were given the 10 commandments, which form the basis of the law of Moses. Craig took us through what the law was, why the law was given to them, to help them remain faithful and to lead them to Jesus Christ as a schoolmaster. And then they entered the promised land under Joshua, and just briefly why Moses wasn't the one leading them into that promised land. So next week, we're going to be covering the judges and the kings of Israel. So who were the judges? Why were they needed? We'll look at Saul being the first king of Israel, and David, who came after Saul. And there's some really cool promises made to David that we'll sort of draw out through that session as well. We'll look at Jerusalem being selected as the nation's capital. And Jerusalem has an important role to play in the future center city of the future kingdom as well, which we'll draw out as we go along in the seminar series. We'll look at political and religious reforms that happened during this period. King Solomon's reign, you might have heard the wisdom or the riches of Solomon. We'll look at how the kingdom got divided between Israel and Judah. So the 10 tribes of Israel and the 2 tribes of Judah, and the good and bad kings over that period. We'll have a look at the prophets that were concurrent during that time of those kings and how they tried to lead Israel back to God. And we'll do a bit of a deep dive on the kingdom of Judah before they were taken captive by the Babylonians. So that's going to be a big week. So the presenters next week will be Steve and Mike. So really look forward to that seminar series.